Imagine watching the highest levels of American politics fold in real time. Chuck Schumer, the Senate veteran who's seen every play in the book, just blinked. And what triggered it wasn't a budget fight or even the government shutdown. It was a mayoral candidate in New York City, Zoran Mamdani, whose sudden rise has thrown the entire Democratic establishment into panic. Because if Manny wins, it won't just reshape New York. It could redefine what the Democratic Party even is. Schumer knows it. Afraid of being primared, afraid of losing control of his caucus, afraid of being cast aside by the very movement his party helped create. The government shutdown we've been living through for over 30 days now. That's not really about budget negotiations or healthcare subsidies, though that's the story you'll hear repeated endlessly. It's about Schumer and Jeff trying to prove to their radical base that they are willing to fight, willing to resist, willing to draw a line in the sand. They are hearing from constituents who used to be reliable voters, but now feel alienated by rhetoric that sounds more like revolution than reform. They are seeing the damage that comes from fielding candidates who seem more interested in ideological purity than practical governance. And in the middle of all this tension, what does Schumer do? He folds. Not because he wants to, not because it's strategic, but because he's genuinely afraid. On the other side, a vocal, energized, and increasingly powerful progressive wing that views any compromise as betrayal, any moderation as weakness. This isn't just political disagreement. This is an existential crisis for party leadership. Because here's what most people don't see on the evening news. Behind closed doors, moderate Democrats are genuinely panicking. They are watching poll numbers collapse in swing states. Let me take you inside what's really happening. Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, Democratic leader, someone who's played the political game longer than most of us have been paying attention, finds himself in an impassable position. On one side, he's got the traditional Democratic establishment, the donors, the moderate governors, all whispering that the party is veering too far left, losing touch with working Americans. Trump knows it. And both men are playing a game far bigger than one election. Trump's already made his move a single shocking statement that turned the race on its head. So the question now isn't just who wins in New York, it's who's really controlling America's future behind the curtain. Stick with me. Because once you see how all the pieces fit together, you'll realize Schumer didn't just fold. He walked straight into Trump's trap. Investigative journalists started pulling threads, following money trails, examining the organizations supposedly supporting Mamdani independently. And what they found was shocking. Multiple reports have surfaced alleging that well over $40 million was funneled through a network of tax-exempt organizations, all supposedly independent, all supposedly grassroots, but all tracing back through overlapping executives, shared office spaces and coordinated messaging to the government-run grocery stores, massive tax increases on the wealthy, rent control expansions, and sweeping social programs. His campaign boasted remarkable grassroots energy, tens of thousands of volunteers, hundreds of thousands of doors knocked, a movement that seemed to emerge organically from the streets of New York. Except it didn't. What looked like grassroots turned out to be something else entirely. Zoran Mamdani was a relatively obscure state legislator. But in the race to become mayor of America's largest city, he suddenly became the front runner, leading in multiple polls, generating enormous enthusiasm among young progressives, and presenting himself as the next chapter of Democratic politics. On the surface, it's an inspiring story. A young socialist reformer barely in his 30s, championing causes like these are men who have spent decades in politics, who understand power dynamics better than almost anyone. And yet they are making decisions not based on what's best for the country, not based on sound strategy, but based on raw political survival instinct. That's not leadership. That's desperation dressed up in a suit. And that fear didn't start in Washington. It began in New York. Even if that line makes no strategic sense, even if it hurts the very people they claim to champion. Because the alternative of being seen as weak, as moderate, as too willing to work with their other side. That terrifies them even more than the shutdown itself. Think about what that means for a moment. In other words, taxpayer money, your money, was being used to build the very network that's now trying to influence elections. It's the same playbook we saw with certain foreign aid programs using public funds to build private political machines. When this information started breaking, the facade began to crack. What once? It's political theater on a massive scale. But wait, there's more. And you're really not going to like this part. Remember how I mentioned tax-exempt organizations? Well, buried in the financial disclosures are government grants somewhere in the range of $50 million or more that were actually subsidizing the infrastructure of these organizations. And here's where it gets even more troubling. Those so-called volunteers knocking on doors. Reports suggest that over 1,000 of them weren't organic volunteers at all. They were paid operatives funded through this coordinated network, deliberately deployed to create the appearance of grassroots momentum. Imagine that. Paying people to pretend to be passionate citizens just to manufacture authenticity. With campaigns. That's the whole point. They are supposed to be genuinely independent voices. But when you've got the same people running multiple organizations, sharing strategies, timing their messaging and funneling resources in coordinated waves, that's not independence. That's a shell game. Same funding sources. We're talking about sophisticated money laundering techniques that resemble what you'd see in corporate fraud cases, not political campaigns. The most damning evidence: internal memos from some of these organizations openly admitting to coordinating what are legally supposed to be independent expenditures. Under federal tax law, groups claiming tax-exempt status can't coordinate directly. How many other grassroots movements are actually well-funded operations designed to look authentic? And that's when Trump stepped in, not with a rally but with a single calculated statement. Now, love him or hate him, and I know people feel strongly both ways. You have to appreciate Trump's sense of timing. While everyone else was caught up in the scandal, while the media was busy dissecting financial documents and interviewing campaign operatives. This was about a systematic attempt to reshape American democracy through manufactured movements and dark money networks. The grassroots myth didn't just evaporate in New York. It exposed a vulnerability that extends nationwide. Because if it happened here in America's largest city, in one of the most scrutinized political environments in the country, where else is it happening? Suddenly, those investigations that initially seemed like niche political insider news became front-page stories. Voters who'd been enthusiastic about Mamdani started asking uncomfortable questions. Moderate Democrats who'd been pressured to stay silent found their voice. And across party lines, people began recognizing a pattern. This wasn't just about one candidate in one race. It terrified the very people who built the system. Because here's what Schumer and Jeff understand that most people don't. Once the public sees through the illusion, once they realize they've been sold a story that isn't true, the backlash is swift and merciless. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. And in politics, trust is currency. Looked like an inspiring grassroots movement, suddenly resembled a well-funded corporate operation wearing a populist costume. The messenger might be talking about socialism and people power, but the machine behind him is anything but grassroots. It's manufactured, coordinated, and potentially illegal. And that revelation didn't just shake New York. Trump waited. He watched, and then at precisely the right moment, he made his move. On Truth Social, his preferred platform, Trump posted what looked like a simple statement, but functioned more like a chess move than a comment. He said essentially, if Mamdani wins, federal funding for New York will be minimal, limited only to what's legally required.